I'm Titus Anderson, producer of the Exploring History podcast. In this episode, you'll hear a conversation between Ray Notgrass and his son John from a webinar titled 1776, The Road to Independence. As we approach the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in July, we hope this conversation will give some context to the history surrounding the events of 1776. Enjoy. Welcome to Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History.
I am here with my father, Ray Notgrass. Hey, Dad.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
You know, my kids think that I'm old enough to have been there when the Declaration was signed back in 1776, but I wasn't there. You weren't there either, were you, Dad?
No, I wasn't there.
Okay, but you do have some memories of the bicentennial in 1976. What do you remember of that time?
Yeah, Charlene and I have been blessed to have lived long enough to experience the bicentennial in 1976, and we saw on television the President Ford giving speeches, and there was a big massing of ships in New York Harbor. And in fact, we went to Philadelphia early in the year for a church seminar, and we drove through the town and saw the banners posted on the light poles proclaiming the bicentennial, and we even got to see the Liberty Bell. So we saw the Liberty Bell the year of the bicentennial. But that's old news. 50 years later, here we are at the semi-quincentennial of America.
Very good, thank you. We've got a few pictures we're going to be showing while Dad talks. And again, if you have questions, feel free to type those in. If you have any technical difficulties, the best solution is usually to just refresh your browser window. That usually takes care of it. If you do miss part of the presentation, we will record this and you can watch it at the same location, the same URL. All right, so Dad, we had 13 British colonies founded from the 1600s into the 1700s. And then what was going on leading up to the year 1776?
Well, I think it's important to keep that in mind. Let me first say again how much we appreciate your coming to this presentation, being a part of it. Trouble had been brewing between the American colonies and the British government for years. Parliament passed various laws that the colonists didn't like, and the colonists sent petitions to the king and the government in London to ask for relief for some changes. The colonists were British citizens, but they had no representation in Parliament. And that was a source of frustration for them. And I think as I look back at British colonial history, Great Britain was not really good at governing colonies. You think Ireland, you think India, and something was lacking there. I don't know, they felt like their colonies ought to just do what they say and accept what they declare, but it wasn't that easy. And then in April of 1775, there were shots fired at Lexington and Concord. And then the two sides fought the Battle of Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, more accurately. And the British won that battle, but at a tremendous price. Now, at this point, the Americans were defending their rights as British citizens. There was some talk of revolt and independence, but public opinion was still forming on what to do about the situation, how to handle it. So there was an uncertainty in the colonies at this point.
And even in England, there was some uncertainty. Edmund Burke gave a speech about conciliation with the colonies in 1775. So there were people thinking about a way to resolve this peacefully, but once the fighting starts, it's hard to put that back in the bottle.
Right.
So what happened at the beginning of 1776?
Well, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet entitled Common Sense. And that pamphlet pushed for American independence. Paine was an exceptionally talented, persuasive writer. And he said in the pamphlet, "'Tis time to part." So that kind of crystallized that side of public opinion, that there are a lot of people who began thinking, yep, this is what we need to do. Now, at this point, the American colonies had lots of things going against them. They had a weak national government. The government that functioned was the Second Continental Congress. Often they couldn't get anything done. As the war dragged on, they often failed to support the American military effort. Congress formed an army in June of 1775, and then just a few days later named George Washington as commander-in-chief. The American military effort consisted of colonial militias that became state militias. They were not professional soldiers. They signed up for a year or two, and many of them left and went home after their period of agreed service was done. By contrast, Great Britain had a large, experienced, professional, well-trained army. They had a huge navy, and they had a string of military victories going back decades in other places, to their credit. So it looked like it was a no-brainer that the British would obviously crush any attempt at rebellion by the colonies. And in fact, at various points during the war, the British Army controlled Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, major port cities in the colonies. So it looked like everything was pointed toward a British victory. Congress, the Second Continental Congress, didn't even have a governing document. They had come together to respond to the situation, and they began work on the Articles of Confederation in June of 76. Just a minimal confederation, coming together really as little as possible to function as a national government. And then when they finished it, the articles, each state had to ratify it. Virginia was the first, but they didn't do so until December of 1777. Maryland was the last, and they didn't ratify it until March of 1781, really just a few months before the war ended. So for most all of the war, the country functioned with a weak national government.
So, weak national government, limited, ill-equipped volunteer army. How did the colonists resist the British military?
Well, I think primarily it was not out of military strength, but out of the strength of conviction that their cause was right. And let me give an example of one man, Henry Knox. Henry Knox was a 25-year-old bookseller. In late 1775, he led a group of men to Fort Ticonderoga, which is 300 miles north of Boston. And his purpose was to take about 56 pieces of artillery, cannon and other things, from the abandoned fort there and move it into action for the Americans. And he dragged that cannon over snow, across frozen waters. Just a tremendous effort by Knox and the men under his command. Why in the world would he do that? In the dead of winter, why would he drag 56 pieces of artillery to Boston? Because he believed in the cause, that's why. He believed in the rightness of the American cause. And in that effort to bring those cannon pieces to Boston, he didn't lose a single piece of artillery. And the artillery, when it was put into place, was instrumental in driving the British out of Boston.
So Richard Henry Lee had an idea. Who was he and what was his idea in the summer of 76?
Very key move here. As we've described, it was a fluid situation. Political, military, diplomatic, public opinion, everything was kind of up in the air. And when things are up in the air, it often takes one person to stand up, be bold, and take a stand. And that's what Richard Henry Lee did on June the 7th, 1776. He introduced a resolution in Congress that stated that the colonies are of right and ought to be free and independent states. He was proposing a complete break with Great Britain, separation, and that the United States, as the resolution called them, would become an independent country. Well, Congress formed a committee to write a declaration explaining the resolution, and it fell to Thomas Jefferson to draft it, which he did in just a matter of a few days. So he submitted the declaration to Congress. Congress debated the statement, and you can imagine Thomas Jefferson sitting there listening to these other delegates slice and chop his work, take out this phrase, put in this word, and so forth. And then on July 2nd, that was not quite a month later, Congress voted to accept Lee's resolution. On July 2nd, the United States came into being. We were our own country, separate from Great Britain. John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that the date, as he put it, ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Adams got it. He got the significance of American independence. And as history has shown us, that's exactly what happens when Americans celebrate their independence. But he was slightly off on the date. He thought it would be July 2nd, but that day of deliverance that Adams spoke of became recognized as the July 4th, which is when Congress adopted Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
So what makes the Declaration significant? What does it say about government and about humans?
The Declaration was a statement of the rights of human beings everywhere. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The delegates did not see how holding people in slavery and bondage really was a hypocritical violation of that right, but that would come. This was the start that would come. Jefferson stated that the king had denied the colonists these rights and had heaped additional abuses on them. So the Declaration declared that the colonies were free and independent states. And in another example of the courage that Americans showed at this time, the Declaration stated, "For the support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And those were not just high-sounding words. These Americans put everything on the line in breaking with Great Britain. In the eyes of the British, this was treason, punishable by execution. And this took the conflict to a higher level than it had been. They were no longer fighting for their rights as British citizens, but they were fighting for their rights as Americans, as human beings. And the delegates signed the Declaration over the coming weeks as they came in and out of Philadelphia. And in another demonstration of the conviction they had in the rightness of their cause, I point out Samuel Hopkins, who was a delegate from Rhode Island. He was in his late 60s. He had been diagnosed with what was then called palsy, probably Parkinson's disease, which made his hands tremble. And as Hopkins signed the Declaration, he had to use his left hand to steady his right hand as he signed his name. And he said, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." Beautiful statement of his conviction that this was the right thing to do.
All right, so we declared independence, and that was it. It was smooth sailing from then, right?
Not exactly. In the summer of 1776, the main British and American armies were drawn up in New York, and the result was a British victory in the fighting that took place there. But in a brilliant move that demonstrated his effectiveness as a leader, George Washington led 9,000 troops across the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan at night without the British knowing that it was taking place. That took leadership to pull that off. Just simply amazing. Another example of Americans' conviction in the rightness of their cause was Nathan Hale. Hale was a 21-year-old spy whom the British captured and executed in September of 76. Before he died, Hale said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." This young man had captured the vision for a country. It was not quite 3 months old, but it's important to notice what he said. He said, "I'm dying for my country, the United States of America." In December of 1776, Thomas Paine came back on the scene, published another stirring work called The American Crisis. And it begins by saying, "These are the times that try men's souls." He encouraged Americans to stay the course, to follow their convictions. And again, he gave the patriot cause a boost. It's like Paine's two publications were bookends for the year, pointing the new country to a greater effort and a greater conviction. And then on Christmas night of 1776, George Washington led a surprise attack across the Delaware River to attack German mercenaries who were fighting for Great Britain. They were stationed in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were enjoying Christmas night maybe a bit too much. And it was a decisive victory. And Washington followed this up with another victory at Princeton, New Jersey, on January 3rd. So finally, the tide was turning. And these developments gave the Patriot cause the momentum they needed to continue the fight for several more years and ultimately gain the victory in the war.
Thank you, Dad. So 1776 was about much more than the Declaration of Independence, but that was the centerpiece and the foundation for the rest of the conflict and the establishment of a new country. So you've talked about, so it started out with some defeats and challenges, and then it ended with some positive things, but that wasn't the end of the war, because there would be the winter at Valley Forge and many more conflicts all across the colonies, and the French helped and other countries helped. It was a long struggle. So you've talked some about how the Americans eventually won, but you want to summarize some of the key points that ultimately led to the American victory?
Sure, yeah. I think the victory came, again, not from greater military strength, although the military force of the Americans did grow and showed much more ability. But again, it was the strength of conviction in their cause. And when someone is convicted that their cause is right, they can do amazing things. I think a second reason for the American victory was the leadership of George Washington and other American Army leaders. A good leader knows not just how to win, but how to withdraw to fight another day. And Washington did that several times during the war. He had this skill. His men admired him. He had character and conviction. And by contrast, many British officers were not good leaders, and they made poor showings in the conflicts that came. Third, I think the bravery and loyalty of the American fighting men were remarkable. Yes, there were a lot of men who went home, but those who stayed endured Valley Forge, endured years away from their homes and their families, for they too believed in their cause. Some of those men would not return home, but they fought for something they believed in. And I think that made a difference. And then finally, I think the providence of God was at work in the American Revolution. How else could you explain a small ragtag army defeating the strongest military fighting force in the world? How else could you explain Washington's selection as commander-in-chief and his careful leadership over 6 years? Certainly the hand of God was with them. So this is how 1776 put us on the road to independence and enabled us to have 2026, 250 years of freedom and continued examples of bravery and self-sacrifice. America's story is a great story. It's one that all Americans should know. And I appreciate your listening, and may God continue to bless America.
This has been Exploring History with Ray Notgrass, a production of Notgrass History. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast in your favorite podcast app, and please leave a rating and review so that we can reach more people with our episodes. If you want to learn about new homeschool resources and opportunities from Notgrass history, you can sign up for our email newsletter at exploringhistorypodcast.com. This program was produced by me, Titus Anderson. Thanks for listening.